I have the pleasure of introducing myself. So my name is Neal Levin. I am a partner at Freeborn and Peters, and I head the fraud and internal investigations team at Freeborn and Peters in Chicago. We're in the business of investigating, prosecuting, and recovering from all sorts of fraud. And we focus primarily on two elements to our team that are supportive of our success. One is the use of intelligence. We have our own intelligence team that we deploy for every one of our cases. And two is the use of psychological profiling of the fraudster. So today, that's what we're going to talk about, which is pretty much my favorite subject. But first, a pop quiz. Hope everyone pays very careful attention. We've got one question for you today, and we'll see who the winner is. Give me the last name of the very first Ponzi schemer. Ponzi? Everyone say Ponzi? It's not Ponzi. Nope, it's not Ponzi. William Miller, 1899, was actually documented as being the first Ponzi schemer. Did exactly what Ponzi did, although with a slightly different vehicle. I quote, "He had the inside window into the ways profitable companies operated." And for 10 years thereafter, his only inside window was that of a jail cell. But he was not the biggest. That's why Charles Ponzi got the namesake, and that happened in 1920. So, a little trivia for you. Next, I'm going to give you a disclaimer. I am not a behavioral scientist. I was a psychology major in college, which of course gave me license to figure out everything that was wrong with my family and my friends. But other than that, I am not a scientist. I am not up here professing anything that I based on my own scientific research. What we do, though, is we study the research of others, and we use that in our law practice. So I am an attorney. I'm an attorney who uses psychological profiling to our advantage, and so we study this stuff. Our team studies this stuff all the time because it's essential, and we'll talk more about why it's essential as we move along. So that's my legal disclaimer. I am not a behavioral scientist. And then I'll make a promise. My promise is that this conversation will be roughly 5% law, if that. So, as much as I'm a lawyer and we practice law, I'm not going to talk about the law. We talk about something we use to help us with the law, and that is the study of the fraudster. So with that, why don't you watch this one for just a couple minutes. Came Madoff, begging the question, what have we become? So this is the study of fraud. It's the study of the fraud for the relationship of Neanderthal all the way up through Madoff. And so to get there, we first have to ask ourselves, well, what is fraud? We can go into the typical definitions of fraud. Fraud is an intentional perversion of truth for the purpose of inducing another in reliance upon blah, 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 blah. We've got this definition from Black's Law Dictionary: a false representation of matter of fact, whether by words or by conduct, by false or misleading allegations, blah, 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 blah. Really, to get to fraud, I think the best way to define it is how we see it every day. So let's talk about the types of fraud first. So we've got many. I'm sure you've been all involved in some aspect of these. Ponzi schemes, of course, one of our favorites. Occupational fraud, fraud that happens from within the organization. Say you're vice president of transportation, creating his own company to build a company. All sorts of transportation charges that never occurred. Insurance fraud, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars in that over the years. Tax fraud, of course. Government corruption. We've got bank fraud. We've got mortgage fraud, asset misappropriation and concealment, corporate governance. We've got bankruptcy fraud. And of course, we've got a couple of our favorites, FCPA and offshore financial centers, which is, of course, why we're here. So let's look at how fraud cases come to us as another way of telling us what really is this fraud that we're talking about. It comes to us from banking clients, comes to us from insurance company clients, comes to us from municipal or local governments and the investigations on corruption, corporations, board-level investigations, which also leads to FCPA and the like. Investors bring us cases relative to fraud. It's probably going to have some investors in some of these cases that David was just showing you in the session before. Receivers and trustees hire us in bankruptcies and other civil proceedings to ferret out fraud and recover from fraud. And typically fraud comes to us when something stinks. This is a label that I actually like quite fondly from one of my clients who said, the time to call Neal is when the case stinks. Another one of my clients says, call Neal because he's like Mr. Wolf from Pulp Fiction. So when things go terribly bad and you need to bring in the help to clean it up, call Neal. So this is how the case comes to us. Well, when does the case come to us? The case comes to us when these three intersect: incentive, opportunity, and rationalization. And we're going to think about this time and time again today. Incentive, opportunity, rationalization. As we talk about the fraudster, let's talk about what was the incentive, what was the opportunity, and what was the rationalization. One of the big incentives or opportunities at this particular point in time of our economic landscape is, I think, illustrated best with Warren Buffett's saying, every now and then the tide goes out and you see who's been swimming naked. So when the bubble burst several years back, the tide went out and we saw a lot of people swimming naked because most of these Ponzi schemes were around for a very long time. These were not one-year schemes, two-year schemes, even 5 or 10-year schemes. These were 20 and 30-year schemes going on for a very long time. But when that bubble burst and the money dried up, necessarily, we see who's been swimming naked. And there's a lot of naked guys in prison right now, but it seems like there's still plenty more out there. So what is the genetic makeup of the professional fraudster? Well, they have a primordial instinct to conquer. There's no rules and no laws for the fraudster. They have to show superiority, and I will argue this one till the day is long, and I get plenty of arguments over it. It's not about the money. I've just said that once. I'm going to say it at least 3 more times today. It's not about the money. There's 2. Money is a byproduct of the need to show superiority. This ego that David was just talking about in the last session. These big egos that they have. Look at every one of the famous fraudsters, and look at some of the not so famous fraudsters. And they all share this need to prove that they're smarter than everyone else. And hence, it's not about the money. And I'll give you one of my proofs for this axiom that it's not about the money right now. We can discuss many of them later offline. But one of them is, look at how much money is amassed. And then ask yourself, why did they continue once that amount of money is amassed? If they had enough money to buy the yacht, and they had enough money to keep the wife happy, and they had enough money to do A, B, and C, or X, Y, and Z, then why not stop? Or why does an extremely wealthy CEO take even more money or misappropriate even more money? Why does a CEO of a bank that's very successful, publicly traded, take an extra $19 million? Because he can. And by doing so, he's showing that he's smarter than everyone else. I will give you one more proof. I was talking with a banker who had invested with a known fraudster. And I said, why, oh why would you do this? You know he's left a trail, and yet you decided to do business with him once again. And the response was astonishing, but proves several of my points. He said, well, we thought this time around we'd be smarter than him, and he wouldn't be able to perpetrate a fraud upon us. And that's this superiority dynamic that we see in business today. A lot of people out there thinking that they're smarter than everyone else. Well, what separates the fraudsters from the not fraudsters? Well, let's move on. Some great quotes from some behavioral scientists. These people are the scientists that we study, and one come from Pinnell in 1745, or he lived 1745 to 1826, the early days of sociopathy. He said, behavior that is marked by a complete remorselessness. Anyone look very closely at the pictures of Bernie Madoff or any of the other fraudsters, Rothstein, Sanford? You get a good look at that picture and you look at their eyes. You see any soul? No soul, no remorselessness. Definition of a psychopath: an intelligent person characterized by poverty of emotions. I love that. Poverty of emotions. Who has no sense of shame, is superficially charming, don't we all know that, is manipulative, we pretty much know that too, who shows irresponsible behavior and is inadequately motivated. A shrewdness and agility of mind. Talks entertainingly, has exceptional charm, and this is all cite again from some early days of psychology in the early 1900s. More specifically, they have no criminal intent. which, by the way, going back to that for a second, our focus is obviously on civil prosecution. We oftentimes package up our fraud cases, put them in a box, add a ribbon, and hand it to the government. We work hand in hand with the SEC, FDIC, a number of different governmental agencies. Just 2 months ago, we had one of our fraudsters sentenced to 5 years out of Houston. This happens all the time for us, this interconnect between civil and criminal. But for those who have any criminal experience, you know that one of the things that you have to show is scienter intent. And so what is the meaning of this paradox of the idea that a fraudster doesn't have criminal intent, and yet we're able to prosecute them successfully based on the theory of intent, that they intended to deceive others? And it's really not their intent. Let's explore that in a minute. Brilliant, highly intelligent, they're opportunistic. I love this story. My mother had a company, and she had an executive assistant working for her, and the executive assistant drove up one day to the front of a nightclub. And there in front of the nightclub was a stand not too dissimilar to this one that I'm standing behind, and it had the price for the valet parking. It's a valet parking, and here's the price. And there was a guy standing behind the stand, and she walked up, and she handed the keys to the guy, and the guy handed her a ticket. And she went inside and did whatever you do inside the nightclub, and she came back out, and she handed the ticket to the guy, and the guy said, "Well, we don't have your car." And it turns out that the guy who was handing her the ticket was not a valet parker. It was just the guy standing behind the podium handing out tickets. And he took the car and left. And so what I like to say about fraudsters is, if you hand a fraudster the keys to the car, they're going to drive it. And I'm going to touch on that some more later, too. They're visible, though not approachable. Madoff was the poster child for that. They live in an alternate reality. They're pathological liars. Just incredibly easy for them to not tell the truth. They're ego-driven control freaks. They have double standards. They'll go to church with their family on Sunday. They'll cheat on their wife on Monday. And they're creatures of pattern. And this is the part that our team really likes. A lot of these guys are very predictive. Their modality is through buy-in and enrollment. They engage investors, lawyers, accountants, other professionals, other participants in their scheme, giving each one only the piece that they need in order to be able to accomplish their objective. And they often have a dominating wife. I'm going to go on to this one for a minute. Almost all of the major fraudsters are guys. And that's a really interesting dynamic to me. And so I'm having a deposition once of one of the fraudsters. And he's with his attorney. And the fraudster was running off at the mouth. Just couldn't say yes or no in response to my questions. Had to tell stories which were getting him into trouble. And his attorney was getting angry. I mean, visibly angry. And kept cutting him off. Yes or no? It's a yes or no question. What's the matter with you? Why can't you just respond yes or no? And at one point, the attorney took a break. And they went out into the hall. And I saw him with the finger pointing like this. He's going at his client. And I'm like, whoa. Wow, what behavior from attorney to client? And this guy was just taking it. He was really just taking it. And then I met his wife. And I was reminded that oftentimes when I depose the wife, they come in completely innocent, right? We call that willfully blind, a concept that we borrowed from the criminal side, and we take it now and we use it in civil law to go after attorneys, accountants, and investors who are willfully blind to the red flags of the fraud. I'm sure you've seen these in all the news stories. So willfully blind. And if you saw the 60 Minutes piece on Mrs. Madoff, and you know how 60 Minutes does those really super close-ups where all you see is like this part of their face. And you just looked at her face, and she went on and on about how she didn't know about any of this happening. And of course, the entire world is watching us and saying, right, you didn't know, sure. And that's willful blindness. That's the picture of willful blindness that we pin up and say, you know what, if they have this look, then they're as guilty as the fraudster themselves. So here comes this innocent woman who didn't know anything, who was blind to all the red flags. And she came in all meek and wanting to cooperate, and yes, Mr. Levin this, and no, Mr. Levin that, and yes this, and yes that. And I got my paycheck and my little allowance, and I went to the spa and I did that, but I had no idea where any of this money was coming from. But then we got her. We got her on some of the red flags. We kind of circled her like a shark, and then about 2 hours into the deposition started laying into her, and she got off her rocker, and she got evil. I mean, she was evil. And she was no longer Mr. Levin and Mr. Levin and Mr. Levin. right? And she was ready to just jump across the table and strangle me by the neck, and it just occurred to me. That's pretty much how this guy's lawyer was treating him, too. And so when this guy goes home, imagine what home life is like. What home life is like. And so let's relate this back to our Neanderthal ancestors and say, who ruled the domain? The female ruled the domain. Man goes out and hunts, brings back meat for family. From there, it's the women. And they rule the domain. So there's been studies on this. I'm not just being sexist here. This is really the way it was. There's studies on this, and one of my favorite is Keogh. I pushed the button and it didn't go, and now it does. Look at that. I'm sorry, Lawrence Kohlberg, The Theory of Moral Development. This is from back in the 50s and 60s. He did these studies on moral development, and he found some fascinating things that relate to exactly what we're just talking about. Men tend to score higher on moral reasoning assessments, relying on abstract principles of right and wrong, while women would condone stealing to meet the immediate need of a hungry child where the father had no means of making a living. So a woman will lie, but she'll do so in a very rationalized manner, whereas men just bluff the people who are asking them questions and make them think that they're moral. And this is why we see at the high level primarily men with the multi-million, multi-billion-dollar schemes, and women actually are doing this more than men as far as volume is concerned, but they're at the lower levels, somehow justifying 5 million, 2 million, 300,000, 20,000. And I don't have the exact statistics to offer you on men versus women because to comb all of the female fraud at that level is extremely difficult because it's often not fully prosecuted. A lot of these things settle out very quickly. They're just too small, and government agencies don't have the resources to go after a lot of the smaller ones. But in our area, and as you've seen from any of the reported cases at these sessions, these conferences, most of these players are, in fact, men. So quite simply, and this is probably one of my favorite theories of all of them, Linda Mealy, who's a modern-day sociologist, wrote in The Sociobiology of Sociopathy that men were simply unable to acquire mates through female choice. What we basically are saying that men couldn't find mates at a young age, and so they have to continue to strut their peacock feathers in order to show their superiority. And this becomes a lifelong quest to show that you're better than everyone else. Think about it. Think about every fraudster you've ever encountered. This will fit. This will fit. They are constantly trying to show you and everyone else that they're smarter than you, even from the prison cell. They will deflect blame to others, even from the prison cell. They will stand up and plead guilty, and then the next day say, but it wasn't my fault. So are these psychopaths or sociopaths? There's some debate in this area, and I'm glad to see that we're starting to see more people in behavioral science study this particular area. And hopefully I'll continue to report on these areas and also continue to employ these things in our practice to leverage our success, which we're going to get to here next. So what are the typical fraudster responses when you first challenge their nefarious activity? Denial and avoidance. Deflecting the blame. They blame the economy. I'm going to file bankruptcy if you push too hard. I had to give it all to my wife. And one of my new favorites is, if I only had more money. I have clients that have that send me a lot of cases against real estate developers. People that were once worth hundreds of millions of dollars and now for some reason don't have anything. And isn't that just the run of the mill these days? And I will tell you, consistently, 90% of the time, the first response we get when we start pushing the developer is, I have an idea. If you guys just loan me some more money and I finish off the project, we're all going to make a lot of money. Right? Anybody have one of those from a real estate developer? I'm telling you, it's just what they do because they are still smarter than you. Or you should never have cut off my funding. Or I can make us money by going into this project or finishing that project. The real estate developer that we are seeing who not honoring their obligations will have as a first response denial, avoidance, or some justification to continue to do business with these people. Step 2 for the fraudster response is then a counterattack. If you, hopefully, reject that type of offer of going back into bed with the fraudster who has already cheated you out of money, they're going to counterattack. One of my favorite was with a guy who we were pretty aggressive with early on with our investigation. We did some trash covers. We interviewed some neighbors. And this is after he had tried to get his way out of it, much like I've outlined for you here. We didn't go for it. And so we came at him from all sides. And so he goes to court with a motion saying that we somehow were abusive in our discovery tactics. So the counterattack. Unfortunately, the judge laughed at it all and said, "You've got to be kidding me. Did he trespass? No, we don't have any evidence of his trespassing. Did he talk to your client while you were representing him? No, he didn't talk to our client directly. Did he commit some law that you can cite for me? No. Then what are you doing here?" But that's step 2. Step 3 is damage control. Once we've moved past this counterattack, and now they realize that the end is potentially near and that we've exposed either the fraud or the assets, they have to go and conduct damage control. And damage control is either a readjust, a liquidation, movement of assets. Some of it, is desperate. Most of it is desperate. And some of it is designed to try and get them out of trouble, move on to the next, which leads us to potentially, in some scenarios, submission. And I put several question marks with submission. Let's go back to this idea of superiority. If the fraudster is feeling he's superior to you, but you break him, you've then proven that you're either his equal, if not superior to him. And time again, I have maintained at least conversive relationships with fraudsters I have taken down. It's almost as though you've been accepted into the tribe of those that are smarter than everyone else. And my favorite story on this one is, actually this was in the middle of a case, but after we had significantly broken this guy down and put him into the largest involuntary bankruptcy in the Northern District of Illinois. And I called up his attorney and I said, "Scott, call Joe and ask him if he'd like to go out to dinner, the three of us." And he's like, "What, are you crazy?" I said, "No, really. Call him and ask if you want to go out to dinner. I'm going to bet you I'll bet you the dinner that he'll go." And I got a call 5 minutes later from Scott and he says, "Well, I'll be darned. You were right. He wants to go to dinner with you." We had the best time. 3.5 hours. We were drinking wines and eating dinner and telling stories and jokes and laughing it up. It was fabulous. One of my true trophy moments. I was accepted by the fraudster at that point because we had broken him. And then they're on to the next thing. And that's why the question marks. It's not a total submission. There's this interim acceptance that I'm broken, I've done my damage control, and it's time to move on to the next thing. When I started this practice some 20-some-odd years ago, I thought to myself, because I have serious accountability issues, I said, when I bust these guys, they're going to change. Right? We're going to right all these wrongs, fix society, change human nature. And boy, didn't I learn the lesson quickly and hardly. It was a very, very eye-opening experience for me to realize you cannot change human nature. And busting a fraudster does not stop the fraudster from committing fraud. How many of you know of stories where fraudsters are still committing fraud from the prison cell? They're still committing fraud because it's what they do. And they have this fixated need to continue to show their own value to themselves and to show superiority over others. All right, let's see this in real time. So when I get these kind of responses from the fraudsters, I ask, well, is that your final answer? Because we're just going to keep pushing on. So anytime the bank says to me, we got this offer for 5 cents on the dollar, and they're showing financial statement, the financial statement shows that they have no money, so we really think we should take this. What do you think? I say, is that your final answer? Or if they say, I'm going to go file bankruptcy, I'm like, is that your final answer? Because, quite frankly, I don't care about those kinds of responses. Those responses are completely irrelevant and useless to try and getting the client's money back. I mean, anybody that relies on the financial statement provided by the alleged fraudster himself, come on, people. We've got to get past that. So there's oftentimes that I'm certain some of you have seen this as well. You get a client from a bank, you get a client from a hedge fund, you get a client from an investor, and you're asking themselves after you see one of those diagonal lines that David just shown you, what were you thinking? investing $1 in this guy, let alone $5 million or $10 million or $100 million. Well, that's why the game has changed. The questions that we ask have to be very different. Our due diligence on everything from pre-transaction assessment, credit assessment, to post-judgment recovery or post-fraud recovery is very, very different. Because the fraudsters don't stop committing fraud. They just change the way the game is played. And you've got to follow. So, psychological profiling now more than ever is essential that we understand the psychological makeup and personality traits and faults of a fraudster in order to effectively dissect their scheme and recover the hidden assets. We must decode the fraudster's theme, not just his actions relative to the transaction. We need to understand his story. We have learned some extremely valuable tools over the course of these 2 days here. Tools about trends, tools about Moreva injunctions, tools about other freezing orders, tools about what jurisdictions allow you to do what in various courts. Those are all extremely important tools. But it's equally, if not more important, to understand who are we going after. Because if you don't understand the story, you can't effectively use the tools. The era of 2, 3, 5 years in litigation and millions of dollars of litigation costs is over. Clients won't tolerate it anymore. We've got to get there faster. We have to be more efficient. And that starts with intelligence and an understanding of the fraudster. So let me give you one small case example. It's small. It's only $1 million case or slightly less. But it's a really fun example of how we now use these tools as part of our recovery efforts for clients. This is Mr. M. That's all I'm going to give you right now. I met Mr. M because a client had an arbitration proceeding that resulted in a large award in his favor. Mr. M was a real estate developer here in the United States, down in Texas, Austin, Texas. He was going to become Mr. Vegas. He wanted to develop big, big, big Vegas properties. So this arbitration proceeding was over one of the Vegas developments. Client 1 had this award, and as is the case with most large law firms, they know how to get judgments, but they don't know how to enforce them. So I got this one after the arbitration award was actually certified. It was an $871,000 award, not huge. Real estate developer, plays in Vegas. Scummy was the word that arbitration counsel used to describe this guy. I'm like, my kind of guy. So we got down to business. We did the usual. I'm sure everyone does these. We checked the databases, Secretary of State, FAA, Coast Guard, Recorder's Office, DMV, Department of Motor Vehicles. We go to the internet, we get articles, we do blogs, right? This is the preliminaries, what we call our phase 1 investigation. This stuff's essential, but it doesn't tell the story. This is just the foundation of the story. And it's a launching point, especially because a lot of the databases, with the speed in which things move these days, are dated. And then social networking sites, of course. Most importantly, we then went to phase 2 and uncovered the theme, decipher the story, learn things about this guy. And one of the early things that we learned, and this is one of my other trophy moments, was that this guy was selling a house that had just gone sort of quietly on the market for $4.5 million in Texas. And so we're browsing around the house, and we're able to see some online photos. Nothing like seeing behind enemy lines, right, online? Well, we went one step better. I emailed the broker. And I said, that's some house you got there. I'd really love to see it. And she wrote back. She said, how about next week? I said, okay, I'm free. I'm coming from Chicago. See you Tuesday. I showed up on Tuesday. She and her husband were there, who works with her in the office. And they toured me through his house. And I toured this fabulous $4.5 million house. And then here's my favorite words. She said, maybe you want to walk through it one more time on your own. I said, don't mind if I do. And I walked through the house. And I looked in the closets. And I looked in the garage. And I found the $150,000 Mercedes that we didn't know about. And I found evidence of a yacht that we didn't know about. And I found what type of computers he has so I can notify my forensic team when we go in to do the mirroring of the computers. And I found all this just fabulous stuff because we got behind enemy lines before I even filed an appearance in the case. The next day, when I filed an appearance in the case, it was met with a motion, here's the counterattack, before the judge for criminal trespass to property or something like that. We went before the judge, and the judge laughed. This sounds like really good field work on Mr. Levin's part to me. I'm not certain what you're complaining about. You invited him on your property. And we did. That's not necessarily how we won the case. That just irritated the fraudster a whole lot. So we did find the house, we found the boats, we found some cars, we found some planes. We found the wives and the kids. But here was the best part. This guy was a real estate developer, as I said, and he was into some big projects, as I said, and unfortunately for him, in 2007, 2008, all these big projects were not so big anymore. They all went bust. He had this website with all these beautiful projects on it, and I'm like, well, gee, it's interesting that he's still sort of marketing the website and all these projects when all these projects are bust. But what we did through our intelligence is find out that he had connections in Dubai. This guy was doing some kind of business there. And so we sent our intelligence team towards Dubai. And what we found out was that he had created a fund in Dubai. And that fund was to invest in what? Distressed real estate. His distressed real estate. He's actually getting a fund to buy back into what he distressed. I mean, it's brilliant. Just brilliant. And so we got the names of the guys in Dubai, and I got myself an airline ticket, and I flew to Dubai. And I'm standing in front of this guy's offices there. Now, by this point, he had started to move sort of in that area between counterattack and damage control. Almost to the point where he had invited me to call him directly so that I can constantly verify the information we were finding out leading towards him not having any assets. So he was very inviting at that point. So I'm in Dubai, and I call him. I said, Chris, nice offices you got here. He says, what are you doing in Dubai? I said, I came to see your offices. They're really nice. I like this setup here. And I pointed out some landmarks here and there so he knew that I was actually standing right in front of his offices. And they really were nice offices. And 6 days, or is it 7 days later, we got paid in full. I didn't get a judge to say, pay Mr. Levin's client. We used intelligence and an understanding of his personality and what he would do and how he would do it and the kind of guy he was as a means of leveraging our ability to force him to pay the client. So here's what it looked like. By the way, that's not him, but that is his Ukrainian wife. That's Mr. Madoff. So the result was we had a settlement agreement for a very short-term payment plan 90 days after we were first engaged. 90 days, not 5 years, not hundreds of thousands of dollars in litigation costs, 90 days. We got $900,000, not $871. We got a premium. It was to be paid over 6 months with the first $250 down. We had a receivership with 24/7 monitoring if we wanted it. We had a temporary injunction. He was put on an allowance. And we were able to monitor all dollars in and out. Charging orders against every one of his 30 or 40 entities. Turnover orders, which we could file with the court as soon as we wanted and take the contents of his $4.5 million house. He had to get life insurance with us as the beneficiary. He had full document disclosure, continuing document disclosure after the settlement. He had to turn over the hard drives, which we held in escrow, if you might, to the extent that we needed if he breached the final payment. And then, of course, we got an immediate release and attached his real estate. We got paid. We got all the money, right on time. This guy would not risk another day of me interfering with his new operation in Dubai, and so he paid us. So the anatomy of a successful fraud case looks something like this. We have many axioms in our practice. One is a fraudster's greatest asset is time. Given time, fraudsters can do remarkable things. Really quite remarkable. In fact, I'm in awe at what these guys have actually done. And that's where this sort of mutual respect comes in. I don't respect that they take advantage of people. I don't respect their lack of remorse and their lack of accountability. But you got to respect their intelligence. In fact, what I respect is that they play the mind game better than we do. They're the true experts in human behavior. How does Bernie Madoff convince Ma and Pa Kettle to invest 100% of their wealth with him, violating Investing 101? Diversification. They put all their money in this guy. That's how good he was at manipulating human behavior. That's what fraudsters do, especially affinity frauds, where they go after a particular segment, like church groups. Or in Bernie Madoff's case, the Orthodox Jewish community. They get us. And they're constantly beating us at the mind game. Which is why one of my many other axioms is you can't regulate against fraud. Try as we might, there's no law that'll stop this human behavior. Yeah, you'll put some obstacles in front of the moving train, throw a couple pieces of furniture at it, but you're not going to stop it. Intensive collection of intelligence is key. Develop the story. You have to understand the person. Look, Bernie Madoff's scheme, other than the size and the amount of years he did it, is not newsworthy. It's not that complex. Bernie Madoff makes it interesting. His wife makes it interesting. His sons, did they know, did they not know? That makes it interesting. Those are the things you need to know, because that's how you penetrate the shield. And then you have a crippling response. Once the noose goes on a fraudster, don't take it off. The minute you take it off, they've got what they need, time. So I've got a couple other case studies. Before I do that, I want to just touch on this idea of regulating fraud as well. This idea of human behavior, human nature, is really essential here as we move into sort of this new era, or some people think that we're moving into a new era. This idea that offshore leaks, the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, the other regulation that we're starting to see come online that's designed to stop certain types of fraud, the threats of shutting down offshore tax evasion or tax avoidance schemes. Are these things really going to change anything? Think about that. Will that change Bernie Madoff? Will that change Sanford? Will that change Rothstein? Will that change Nevin Shapiro? Will that change Axiom? Will that change any of these people? I profess that it won't. And I look forward to a debate on that subject with anybody. I just don't see us being able to change human nature through regulation. Well, then how do we change this stuff? We change it by being better than them at their own game. We infiltrate the game. We play the game, but not for purposes of winning the game. And this really is a game. It's a game to them. Think about it this way. I'm Neanderthal. There's my enemy. I can only work with what I have between here and there to defeat my enemy. There's a stone. Here's a club. It's pretty much all Neanderthal had at the time. I will pick up whatever stone I come across. I will grab whatever club I can get access to, and I will beat until I win. That's a fraudster. They don't think about the consequence. There's no remorse. There's no accountability. Now I ask this question. What's the difference between a fraudster and an entrepreneur? They do the same thing, don't they? They're very cunning, very clever, very intelligent. They'll use whatever they can find from here to there to achieve their goal. So how do we distinguish the two? I say it's two things. Lack of remorse and lack of accountability. When we cross that line, we know we're dealing with a fraudster. Because even an entrepreneur would be remorseful if he hurt somebody, a non-fraudster entrepreneur. So remorse and accountability. If you don't have that when you enter in, you know you're dealing with a fraudster. So a couple other quick case studies. I think and we'll leave some time for questions. I know we ran late before, and I want to keep people. I think a lot of people are leaving. Dubai Part 2. So we had a call from a client out in California, one of the major motion picture studios. And they sell rights to their intellectual property all around the world. And for some really strange reason, they sold rights to a BVI shell company. Now, they knew that that BVI shell company somehow, they didn't know exactly how, but somehow was related to a company in the Middle East that was broadcasting their intellectual property. But they never really drew the connection. They never understood the connection. When they were handed the contracts, it just had the name of this BVI company on it, and they signed it. Okay. That does beg a pretty interesting question. Can you have fraud when Ma and Pa Kettle violate Investing 101? Can you have fraud when my client doesn't exercise appropriate levels of due diligence? Can you have fraud when a bank goes back into bed with a fraudster? Is that really fraud? So we have to look at this other very uncomfortable piece when we discuss the mindset of a fraudster, and that's the mindset of the people that the fraudster does business with. And I say it's uncomfortable because it's not really nice to look at ourselves and say, we're greedy. Because if you don't have greed, you don't have fraud. It doesn't exist. Greed is the wound upon which the fraudster preys. Remember, they're the experts in behavioral science. They see greed and they capitalize on it. And greed comes in many different forms, both commercially and consumer. So here's this situation that I'm handed from my client, where my client didn't exercise a decent level of due diligence, so I'm working already from behind the 8 ball. And we start to unravel the story of how these companies are related, and we go through the islands, and then the line draws up to the UK, and then the line comes back down to Saudi Arabia. Well, actually, at the time, it came down to Bahrain, and then Dubai, and then ultimately a connection back to one of the princes of Saudi Arabia. And so we figure out this convoluted set of interrelated companies, and one of those charts that you saw earlier with the lines going every which direction. And in uncovering that, we realize, okay, the story is that they're doing business this way with lots of people around the world, and this is how they go about doing it, and these are the entities that they use. And so we figured it out. And when we figured it out, we didn't file a lawsuit against them. I got on a plane. And I got on a plane with a document this thick that looked like it was the filing of a lawsuit, but you know what the most important page of that document was? Was the notice page. Because I was about to stop every dollar that these people were paying to any United States concern. I was going to get freezing orders in New York that would stop every dollar that they would pay through the exchange coming into the States. And so I therefore had to notify the recipients of that money to tell them they probably wouldn't be getting their money and let them file claims if they wanted to. And I took that document to the CEO of the Dubai-based operations, and I said to the secretary who met me at the door, I'd like to see your boss. She says, well, yes, you don't have an appointment. I said, well, I've come a long way. I'd like to see him. She says, well, he won't be back until 2:30. I said, oh, come back. I went back at 2:30. And she came down again. She said, I don't really know what this is about, so he won't see you. I said, do me a favor. Hand him this document. I'm going across the street to the little tea house there. Here's my cell phone number. Tell him to give me a call after he reviews it. And I get a call within 20 minutes. And the guy says, I don't really know what this is about. You got the wrong entity. I said, we kind of figured out your shell game, and let me give you a couple of pieces. Point to page 8. Take a look at that. Look at page 26. We understood this relationship. We got that merger. Got your website that says this over here. We got this document filed over in Saudi that says this over here. And a week later, we got paid. And I never filed a document with the court. And that was strictly because of our due diligence, the investigation that we undertook to unravel the theme, figure out how these guys were doing business, and threaten to break it down. Legitimately. These were not idle threats. These were legitimate threats to break it down. But we knew the hot button to push in order to get them to pay. Sudden stop cases, and I'll probably wrap it up after this. Represented a major insurance company. The insurance company was the victim of millions of dollars worth of false claims. A scheme that we call the sudden stop accidents. These were very famous in the 90s in the United States, where street-level players would go out in junky old cars and slam their brakes in front of very expensive cars, and then you'd have a series of medical claims that were administered by a series of unscrupulous chiropractors, doctors, and lawyers, and money launderers. This went on to the tune of $15, $20 million before State Farm finally uncovered it. And the investigation was intense. These people had started from Russia. The key player had moved from Russia to California and was a taxi driver while he put himself through chiropractic school. He became a chiropractor and never practiced chiropractic, but instead started a little clinic where he brought in other chiropractors to help him sort of developed this business and looked for these types of claims. And then he started a school and tried to get federal funding with the school, despite the fact that the school had no students whatsoever, and he received federal funding. He got in some trouble for that, and we chased him to Texas, where he started a series of pain clinics, acute pain clinics, and which they have a lot of in South Texas if you've ever been there. It's a hotbed of insurance fraud. And through that, developed an $80 million operation in acute pain care, and then we took him down. And this is the guy that actually was just sentenced to 5 years for his second violation. He tried to hide all this by running into bankruptcy. We had a massive investigation through the bankruptcy court, but my favorite part of the story and the investigation in bankruptcy was the time that the judge gave us an order to go in and examine his household computers, which he had professed all along were his wife's. In fact, everything this guy owned was his wife's. We put her on the stand. Of course, she didn't know anything. All the business enterprise was in the wife's name. So, not uncommon. And we send the computer forensic team in to mirror the computers, and they had all been shredded with a commercially available digital data shredder. But he was able to have enough time at midnight the night before our team went in to reinstall the camera interface. And he had plugged his camera in, and he had uploaded a bunch of photos, which just happened to be from his birthday party a couple days before, with a bunch of his friends out on his lawn in front of his yacht on the waterway not far from here, having caviar and vodka. And you could bet that that was the picture that I had up on the screen when we walked into the courtroom at the contempt hearing for having destroyed all the data during a bankruptcy proceeding. And the judge found that actually very helpful. So that guy took 5 years for his bankruptcy fraud. Sure enough, by the way, 6-8 months later, we went in with a full swarm of local police, U.S. Marshal Service on a court-ordered raid without notice with the trustee and his attorneys in tow, and sure enough we found the data that had all been removed from those computers, and it basically sealed this guy's fate. But once again, we beat this guy through our use of intelligence gathering and deciphering the story of who he is, how he operates, and his cabal of cohorts that he would use along the way to achieve his objective. So, the conclusion is, especially in light of where we are in the economy, and especially where we are in light of what's going on offshore, and the different financial centers and the turmoil, is not necessarily how are we going to ultimately stop fraud, because I don't think it's going to stop, but what does the next fraud look like? And this requires us to be much more diligent in our due diligence, both pre and post investment, pre and post transaction, pre and post, whether it be lending, investing, any other type of business-to-business transaction. Even the fallout from the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is such that we have these monitors going in place, and the monitors are looking at things that we didn't have to micro-monitor before. So the game's changed, the questions have changed, and the best way to ask the questions is to have a complete understanding of the fraudster as we go forward. So with that, I open it up to any questions. That's actually a really good question, and that's being heavily debated. So if we go back to some of the experts that I've cited in the presentation, there's two schools of thought in psychology. There's the behaviorists and the geneticists, right? And those that think that we're born a certain way and those that think we become a certain way. According to one of the theorists, we become that way because we can't find a mate early on. And then there's other theorists that say that we are just genetically wired to have to prove that we're smarter. I come from the school of thought of the behavioral side. I think we do become fraudsters. I don't think we're born fraudsters. And I think we have a lot of environmental pressures that add to that triangle of incentive meeting opportunity meeting rationalization. Incentive, again, is not the money. The incentive may be simply a chance to prove that you're superior. And then you capitalize on opportunity to do that, and then you rationalize it any number of ways, including it's your fault, not mine. You didn't conduct appropriate due diligence, or you lend me too much money. I love that one. You lend me too much. You should never have lent me that money. Other questions? Yes, sir. I'm sorry, say it again?
Do they have like the same childhood, the fraudsters?
The same?
Childhood.
Childhood. So again, I think according to the theorists, no, they would be different. There are some, there is one school of thought that says several of the fraudsters that we might see in the mainstream news started out legitimate. There's a famous story of a guy who is in his 20s. He's got an older brother. He comes home one day, and his father's bent over, crying, bawling, and Father, what's wrong? This is a true story. Father, what's wrong? And the father shows a newspaper article of his brother on the front page having been ferreted out for fraud. And he swore to his father right then and there, Dad, I will never, ever be like that. And 10 years later, he was exactly like that. So is it a genetic predisposition? One of the clinical psychologists that I talked to about that particular matter said no, not genetically predisposed. This guy had something going on with his father. Either he wasn't trusted by his father, he didn't get the attention he was looking for when he was young. So this clinical psychologist assessing that case says this was behavioral mod through time based on environmental issues, or environmental influences, as opposed to being genetically predisposed to conduct that fraud. Yes, sir.
Hi, Martin Kenny from the BVI. Mr. Neal, Dr. Alexander Stein is a psychoanalyst in New York, and he's doing a lot of interesting work in the same field. He posits the view that it's too limiting to look at the psychology only of the fraudster. He breaks down the process if it's one of asset recovery or the provision of remedies to victims, which seems to be our overarching objective professionally, as involving 5 critical relationships which have their own psychological dimensions. He posits the view that historically we have to look at the victim-fraudster relation. This is the one that, you know, where there's a fraudster, there's also a victim, and the victim's pathology needs to be understood as much as the fraudster's in order to unlock insight into how the fraud was perpetrated, to provide insight into how perhaps the secondary strand of this activity, the laundering and the concealment part, which creates information barriers that stand between the victim and his money, that this is very crucially important, is to get into the victim's head as much as the fraudster's. So that relationship is critical. Yep. Second, the fraudster and the asset recovery team has its own independent relationship, which is you started to probe yourself in your remarks. Mm-hmm. The third relationship is the asset recovery team and the victim. This is, as you know, when you represent victims, right, particularly multiple victims, it's like corralling cats. They go through denial, they go through pain, they go through a whole bunch of things. I've had clients with suicide issues, etc. So you've got that relationship, our team and their clients, and that to motivate the victims to seek remedy, for instance. Then the fourth one is the asset recovery team and the judge, or the judges. And then the reverse side of that coin, the judge's relationship with the fraudster and his team. And then the fifth relationship is the asset recovery team introspectively. In other words, when you're running your own team, that's a series of interlocking, sensitive human relationships that are crucial for motivation purposes, for discipline, to mass resources, to win a case. So he posits the view that we have 5 different things happening at once. And then he was trained in the area of helping CEOs, legitimate businessmen, run their own networks of people introspectively, effectively and efficiently to, quote, win, to make money legitimately for their shareholders or what have you. So his view is you can flip that when attacking the fraudster's network of people to exploit their weaknesses, mm-hmm, by reverse engineering the opposite of what he does usually, which is to help leaders lead their people better. In this way, how can we as recovery professionals exploit weaknesses within the fraudster's network by identifying weak relationships that they're relying on in order to carry the day?
You know, we could spend days, and I would love to, because I find this fascinating, and I couldn't agree more with those axioms. But ask yourself this question in response to that. Look what the fraudster has done. look what the fraudster has put into play, right? These five elements, this fallout from what the fraudster has done is not unknown to the fraudster. One of our many other axioms is that litigation is a line item on the business plan of a fraudster. They get it. They know how to use it. They'll find some attorney who will file a series of motions that will slow down your process. They'll throw all the furniture in front of the moving train. You know, I like that saying. And it's not about the money, again, right? Because as long as they stop you in your tracks, or slow you down at least, they're winning. And so all of those things are the intended fallout. We're going to frustrate the process, the fraudster says, so much that you'll either walk away from it, give up at some point in time, or be costed out of being able to continue. But I think each one of those is a necessary component to look at. And that's, I touched on the idea of looking at the uncomfortable concept of looking at the victim. Because the victims, yes, are victims, but we have to look at the idea of how they became victims. And so again, I sort of just tossed out as a teaser this idea that we're not going to change human nature through regulation. We're going to change human nature by looking at the way we do things, by the way we play in business, by the way the non-fraudster plays in business, and play the game differently. Thank you for that. That's great insight. Yes, sir.
I just had one comment. I worked in law enforcement for a lot of years, and I always say, like, a serial rapist, a serial murderer, a serial fraudster, there's a lot of similarities. It's that continuation of a defined offense and having to just keep doing it.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you. Did someone have a question here? Nope. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much for your time.